Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a brief history of McDonald's pictures and a little bit about the life of James McDonald. McDonald's pictures later became the King's and then finally the Queen's, the latter being most likely the name the majority of people will remember. I hope you will find this interesting. McDonald's Pictures was a purpose-built building on Station Road built by James McDonald. James McDonald was born in around 1870 in Newcastle and had married Margaret in 1893. By 1901 he was living with his family in Buddle Street in Wallsend and was running the Wallsend Cafe, or the Coffee Palace as it used to be called. His brother Matthew also worked with him. If you haven't already seen it, it might be worth watching the video about the history of the Coffee Palace. It would seem for about a year prior to the building of the picture house, James had been, as was described at the time, showing pictures successfully elsewhere. No location is given, but based on my research into the cafe and its rooms upstairs for entertainment, I am willing to guess that this would have been the location he had been using. Because he had been doing so well, he decided to build his own picture house to his own requirements. He had no desire to waste any time. He wanted the hall built as quickly as possible, and luckily for him he found a builder who was willing to do the job. Mr. W.C. Thompson was that builder, and the whole place was built in around 6 weeks at the cost of £1,200, which in today's money would be around £182,000. The picture hall opened in around April of 1909, and it was described at the time as being rather unconventional in its external appearance. However, the article doesn't say what was different about it to other picture houses at the time, and it was still classed as a great success for the architect, so it can't have been all that strange for the period in which it was built. The outside walls were described as being terracotta bricks with white cement, and the main entrance was said to be unusual in design, as it was not flat to the wall but built out like a modern-day porch. The hall was said to be well ventilated and had 3 exit points. The whole building was said to be fitted with every possible safety feature that was available at the time. James McDonald claims that even if the operating machinery was to catch fire, the audience in the hall would know nothing about it, as it was quite cut off by walls from the rest of the building. There were 2 projectors, and James is said to have arranged for the very latest films to be shown each week, with 2 shown per night. At the other end of the hall there was a large stage, and behind this a dressing room, and it was said that variety turns would be put on in the building as a special feature, but it didn't suggest how often that this would happen. The hall is said to be 68 feet long by 43 feet wide, with seating available for around 550 people, and there are tip-up seats and cushioned chairs. The prices are 1 shilling, 6d, 4d and 2d, and I am absolutely hopeless with old money, so I cannot work out what 6d is, etc., but I am sure some of you will know what that means. The highest price seats are at the back of the hall, and I would assume this would mean you would get a better view of the screen from there, and it was said that this idea, the seats at the back, was much more popular in Wallsend than it had been when it was tested in London. The hall is said to have a decorative interior with oak doors that have been stained dark green, and the walls are buff, which is apparently a light brownish yellow with a red border and a white roof, and the building is fitted with electricity and heated by gas stoves. James's right-hand man, as he was described, is Mr. A. Richardson. It would seem that he would be running things for James, and it was said that with the hall being so fine, they should have no problems continuing the success they have had in the previous year. The only thing that the newspaper article was not happy about was they felt that the hall needed a name. It seems they didn't feel that McDonald's Pictures was good enough. However, the name seemed to serve it well for several years, as it wasn't until 1913 that it was changed, and it was then known as the King's Picture House, and by 1921 it had been renamed the Queen's Picture House. The picture house itself must have worked out quite well, as by 1911 James and his family were now living at 29 Laburnum Avenue. I was able to trace the details about James from a letter he had written about the picture house with his Laburnum Avenue address on it. By going backwards from these details, I was able to work out who he was and the fact that he was indeed the man who also ran the Wallsend cafe, and he was still working at the cafe in 1911, and his son John was working there with him as well. In 1912, while renewing the picture hall licence, it was said that the police had had issues with both McDonald's, as it was still known at the time, and the Tyne Picture House for having too many people inside the buildings. People were said to be standing in the aisles, and this was not allowed. It was said that both had put up notices telling people it was against the law to stand in the aisles, but they said that the people took no notice. However, because they were doing the best they could and not ignoring the issue, they did both get to renew their respective licenses. James McDonald would usually hold a Christmas breakfast in his picture house every year for the poor children of Wallsend. The food was free and there would be entertainment afterwards. The picture house was in use until around 1961, when, like a lot of other picture houses in Wallsend, it finally closed for business. I can only assume that larger out-of-town cinemas were starting to take the trade away from the smaller towns. The building, in later life, has had a few uses. From at least 1970, it was a car showroom known as Viscount Garage. I couldn't find any details for the garage prior to that date, but it may well have been there sooner, and it was certainly still in business in 1981. The advert you can see on screen at the moment is from 1970. I haven't been able to find an actual closing date for the garage, but maybe somebody listening knows. Later it became Plasterpiece, selling fires and fire surrounds. The earliest advert I could find for this was 1996, but again, it may have been there before that. Plasterpiece advertised its closure in 2011. I can remember going inside when it was Plasterpiece, and I have to admit I would have had no idea at all that it had once been a picture hall, as it was completely different inside, and even the main entrance had totally changed. Since 2011, the building has had a few short-term uses. It remained empty for quite some time, and then it was briefly known as PlayStation from around 2016, and to the best of my knowledge it is currently used by Shooting Stars Childcare. There is very little information about how long James was the owner of the picture house, but he probably still had an interest in it until his death. James McDonald was quite a common name in the Wallsend area, and I had to do a lot of research into the later details of his life to try and find the right man, and I am around 99.9% certain that the following details are about the same man who once owned McDonald Pictures. James died in April of 1937 at the age of 69 whilst living in Wilton Key. Some of the family names at the funeral, John, Charles and Thomas, were the same as the names of his children, so I do feel that this was indeed him. Outside of Wallsend, he was well known in South Shields in connection with the sport of road walking, for which he had donated a cup which was used for many years. Sadly, the only photo that I could find of James is, as you can see, not a very clear one. He was also a member of the Wallsend Bowling Club and was actually the vice president for a time. He does seem to have been a very well-known man in Wallsend, with his work at the Coffee Palace, his picture house and his sporting activities, and also being a well-known member at the Wallsend Masonic Hall. And he also seems to have given a lot back to the town with his charity work for the poor children, among other things. The location of his burial was not given in the article about his death, but the service was conducted by the Reverend D.U. Rutherford of St. Paul's Church in Howden. I have searched, but I have not been able to find any details of a headstone for James in either Churchbank Cemetery or in Holy Cross. I hope that you have found this story interesting. I am sure some of you will remember going to the Queen's Cinema, as I doubt anyone is old enough to remember it as the King's or as McDonald's, and maybe like me you are somewhat amazed to find that it's still standing when it took only 6 weeks to build. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again very soon.